My brother showed up at my apartment on a Wednesday evening with my niece's backpack in one hand and his car keys already jingling in the other. The universal body language of someone who has no intention of staying. He was wearing that smile he always uses when he's already decided something. Not asking. Telling. The one our mum used to say meant he'd already won whatever argument hadn't started yet. I'd watched that smile work on teachers and coaches and clients for 38 years, and I still hadn't figured out how to stop it from making me feel 12 years old. "I need you to take Cora for a few days," he said, stepping just barely past my doorway, not far enough to suggest he was actually coming in. "Work trip. Last minute. You know how it is." I didn't know how it was, actually. He's a real estate agent in Hamilton. Real estate agents don't take work trips. But before I could say that, he was already squatting down to Cora's level, giving her a little pat on the shoulder that looked more like someone checking whether a piece of fruit was ripe than any kind of parental send-off. "Be good," he told her. Then he stood up, handed me a $20 bill, a single 20, for what would apparently be several days of childcare for an 8-year-old, and headed back down the hallway toward the elevator. He stopped once and turned around. "Don't get her too settled in," he said, and his voice had that particular lightness that doesn't mean lightness at all. "When I'm back, things are going to look a lot different." The elevator doors closed. He was gone. I stood there with a $20 bill in one hand and my niece's entire worldly belongings in a single backpack, and I genuinely could not make sense of what had just happened. Behind me, the apartment was quiet, except for the kettle I'd left on before he rang. Outside, I could hear the March wind off the escarpment rattling the hallway windows. Cora hadn't said a word. She was still standing exactly where he'd left her, holding the straps of her backpack with both hands, knuckles completely white. She looked up at me. Not sad, not about to cry. Just watching me very carefully, the way children watch adults when they're deciding whether or not to trust them with something important. "Aunt Abby," she said very quietly, "I need to show you something, but you have to promise you won't call him. Not yet. My name is Abby. I'm 32 years old, and I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Hamilton's Lower City, where I work as a project coordinator for a housing nonprofit. Which is a polite way of saying I write grant applications, negotiate with city bureaucrats, and spend a significant portion of my professional life coaxing our ancient photocopier back to life. I am not a lawyer. I don't have a law degree, a business degree, or any particular expertise in estate planning or trust administration. Up until that Wednesday evening in March, the most complicated legal document I'd ever dealt with was a lease renewal. My brother and I grew up on the mountain, the upper part of Hamilton, for anyone not from here, in a semi-detached on a street where everyone knew everyone's business and nobody said so. He was 6 years older than me, always the one with the plan, the angle, the pitch. He went straight into real estate after college and built himself a solid career selling properties in Stony Creek and Ancaster. He married, and his wife was kind and funny and loved fiercely, and when she got sick, ovarian cancer, 2 years ago after a long and brutal fight, losing her broke something in all of us. She had a daughter from before they got together, Cora. My brother had been raising her since she was 3. He coached her hockey team. He made her lunches. He went to every school concert wearing the same embarrassing orange toque because she'd told him once that she could always spot him in the crowd. By all appearances, he was a devoted father, even after the biology didn't technically require it. But about 8 months ago, he started seeing someone new. His girlfriend, a woman I'd met exactly twice. She had this way of speaking about Cora as though the child were a scheduling conflict. The last time I'd seen them together at a dinner in January, she'd leaned over to him while Cora was within earshot and said, "You know, you don't actually have to do all of this. You have options." As encouragement. She'd meant it as encouragement. Cora had looked down at her macaroni and kept eating without saying a word. I'd thought about that dinner for months afterward and not known what to do with it. Being unkind isn't against the law. But standing in my hallway, with my niece's careful eyes on my face, I felt whatever had been sitting uneasily in my stomach since that dinner finally turned into something solid. I brought her inside. I made hot chocolate, real cocoa powder and whole milk, not the powder packet kind, and I sat across from her at my kitchen table and waited. Cora opened her backpack. From underneath a change of clothes and her stuffed moose. She'd had him since she was 4, a gray and brown plush thing she'd named Buddy after our great-uncle, who she'd adored. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, creased over and over, like it had been read and folded and read again many times. She placed it on the table between us and smoothed it flat with her small palms. It was a real estate listing agreement, signed, with an accepted offer for the Muskoka cottage. The cottage needs explaining, because it explains everything. My great-uncle, my father's uncle, spent 40 years working for Ontario Hydro and saved almost everything he earned. He was a quiet, deliberate man who distrusted fuss and loved lakes, and kept his finances in a green ledger notebook right up until he died. He never married and never had children, and when he wrote his will, he left almost nothing to the adults in the family. He left his truck to my father, and he left his lakefront property near Port Carling in Muskoka, valued at the time of probate at approximately $890,000, to Cora. Not to my brother, not to the estate generally, to Cora specifically and entirely. He had loved her the way that particular kind of person loves a child who has no biological obligation to love them back. She used to draw him pictures and mail them to his apartment because she thought getting real mail was exciting. She called him Uncle Buddy, which had never been his name, and he had never corrected her. When she lost her front tooth up at the cottage the last summer before he died, he kept the tooth in a small paper envelope in his desk drawer. We found it there when we cleaned out his things. His will established a formal trust. The cottage was to be held for Cora until she reached 19, Ontario's age of majority. My brother, as her legal guardian, was named trustee. He could not sell the property, refinance it, or transfer ownership without explicit approval from the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. His estate lawyer had been emphatic about this. Properties in Muskoka were only going to appreciate, and this one was already worth nearly $1 million. My brother had signed the trustee obligations paperwork. I had been a witness at the signing table. Now I was looking at a listing agreement bearing his signature, an accepted offer, a closing date that was 72 hours away. The purchase price was $940,000, a deliberate undervaluation for a property that had certainly risen since appraisal. But that wasn't even the worst part. At the bottom of the form, in the section requiring Superior Court approval for the trustee to proceed, there was a court seal and a signature. I stared at it for a long time. Something was wrong with it. I knew what government documents looked like from my work: grant approvals, funding letters, official correspondence from the province. This seal looked like it had been printed on a home laser printer. The font was slightly off. The signature line had none of the specific formatting I'd seen on court-issued documents. It was a forgery. I didn't need a lawyer to see it. I needed a lawyer to stop it. I looked at Cora. She was watching me over the rim of her mug with those very steady, very old-seeming eyes. "Where did you find this?" I asked her. "His briefcase," she said. "I wasn't snooping. I was looking for a pen." A pause. "He's been on a lot of calls lately, always goes outside to make them. I heard the cottage mentioned a lot. Do you understand what this document is?" She thought about it for a moment, genuinely thinking, not performing thought. "It's a paper to sell something that's supposed to be mine," she said. "And I don't think a real judge signed that part at the bottom. It doesn't look the same as the copies my dad has, from when Grandpa's estate was settled. Those look different." 8 years old. She didn't know the word forgery. She knew the document was wrong anyway, because she'd been paying attention when the adults in her life assumed she wasn't. "Cora," I said carefully, I need you to not say anything about this to your dad. Not for a few days. Can you do that? She nodded. I've already been not saying anything, she said. For 3 weeks. I waited until she was asleep on the couch before I let myself start shaking. I sat at my kitchen table with the listing agreement and my phone and tried to think past the noise in my chest. I needed someone who knew estate law. I needed them tonight. I had 72 hours, give or take, before a sale that couldn't be easily undone would close on a property that didn't belong to the person selling it. Through my nonprofit work, I knew a family law solicitor, Ms. Park, who had done pro bono work with some of the families our organization served. I texted her at 11 o'clock at night, apologized for the hour, and said it was urgent. She called me back within 10 minutes. I talked as fast as I could without losing clarity. I told her about my brother, the cottage, the trust terms, the listing agreement, the closing date, the forged court seal. I could hear her breathing change as I went. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Send me that document right now, she said. And Abby, do not contact your brother. Don't change anything about how you've been responding to him. If he senses you know, he could try to accelerate the transfer or liquidate whatever he can reach before we get to court. What happens if we can't stop it in time? I asked. Another pause, a careful one. If that sale closes, she said, the cottage transfers to a third-party buyer who almost certainly has no knowledge of the fraud. Recovering the property from an innocent purchaser is extraordinarily difficult, even with proof of trustee misconduct. The litigation could take years. Cora could lose most of what was left to her. She let that sit for a second. We need to file an emergency injunction with the Ontario Superior Court of Justice and request an emergency hearing. Given the timeline, we'd need to move tonight. It's possible, but we have to start now. After I hung up, I sat there for another moment in the quiet of my kitchen. Then my phone buzzed. My brother. Is she settled? Eating okay? I put my hands flat on the table. I breathed in slowly. I picked up the phone and typed, "She's great. Fast asleep. Don't worry about a thing." He sent back a thumbs up. I turned the phone face down and got to work. The next 48 hours were the longest of my life, and I mean that without any drama. I have genuinely never experienced time move the way it moved over those 2 days, elastic and strange, minutes that felt like 20 minutes, entire hours that disappeared. Miss Park worked through the night. She had a colleague in estate litigation who she pulled into the matter, and between them they built the injunction application in real time while I sat at my kitchen table, scanning documents, answering questions by text, and forwarding everything I had. The forged seal, the listing agreement, the original trust documentation from our great-uncle's estate, the trustee obligations my brother had signed. I wasn't alone in doing it. Cora woke up around 1 in the morning and found me still at the table surrounded by papers. She didn't ask what I was doing. She sat down across from me, wrapped in the blanket from the couch, Buddy the moose tucked under her arm, and she helped. She knew which documents her father had printed at home versus which ones had come from the actual estate lawyer's office. She could distinguish his real signature from the quicker version he used when he was rushing. She knew things I would never have known to ask about, because she had been quietly paying attention for 3 weeks, while the adults around her assumed she wasn't following any of it. At around 2 in the morning, she looked at me over the pile of papers and said, "He used to take me up to the cottage every August. Before." I didn't say anything. "She doesn't like it up there," Cora continued, meaning his girlfriend. "She said it was too rustic. After they started dating, he stopped bringing me. He said it needed too much upkeep." She looked down at Buddy. Uncle Buddy loved that cottage more than anything. He said the lake in the morning looked the same as it did when he was a little boy. "It does," I said, because I'd been there enough times to know. "He left it to me because he knew I'd take care of it," she said. "He told me that." He said, "Cora, this place needs someone who'll still love it when it's old." He meant me. I had to look at the wall for a moment. Then, we're going to make sure you keep it, I said. She nodded, as though that had never really been in question for her. Only for me. Ms. Park filed the emergency injunction application at 6:30 the following morning. By noon, we had a hearing date, 9 a.m. the next day, at the John Sopinka Courthouse in downtown Hamilton. The injunction, if granted, would freeze the property transfer and open an immediate judicial review of the trustee's conduct. I spent the afternoon keeping things ordinary. I took Cora to get groceries. I let her pick her cereal. We walked through Gage Park on the way back, because she wanted to show me something she'd seen there earlier in the week. A pair of mallards that had taken up in the wading pool, even though the water wasn't running yet. Just sitting there in the empty concrete bowl, apparently fine with the arrangement. We stood and watched them for a while. My brother texted twice, once to say the trip was going well, once to ask if Cora had been eating. I replied to both with total normalcy, my thumbs not shaking at all, which surprised me. That night, I made spaghetti for dinner. I let her stay up an extra half hour. I tucked her in at 9:30, and she was asleep with minutes. Buddy tucked under her chin, one sock on and one sock off the way she always slept, and I stood in the doorway for a long moment before I went back to the kitchen. Then I sat on the edge of the bathtub and cried very quietly for about 5 minutes. Then I washed my face, checked my email, confirmed the hearing time with Ms. Park, and went to bed. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, the kind of institutional stillness that settles over official spaces in the early morning. There were other matters on the docket ahead of ours. Other families in their own private emergencies. Sitting in the gallery with the particular silence of people who don't want to make eye contact with each other's pain. Cora sat between me and Ms. Park's colleague, very upright, Buddy sitting on her lap with the same uprightness, like they'd coordinated. My brother didn't know we were there. He came in at 8:55 with his girlfriend at his side, and his own lawyer just behind him, carrying a slim document folder and an expression of moderate confidence. My brother was leaning slightly toward his lawyer, murmuring something. He looked like a man walking into a routine appointment. He looked like someone who had already solved the problem before he arrived. He took his seat at the respondent's table. His lawyer opened the folder. His girlfriend crossed her legs and checked her phone. Then, because the gallery was arranged the way it is in these smaller courtrooms, he turned slightly to survey the room, the reflexive, social scan of a person who is used to walking into spaces and taking stock of them. He saw me. I watched the calculation happen on his face. The beginning of a confusion, then the start of something else. A species of dread that hasn't fully landed yet, still trying to make sense of the information. Then he saw Ms. Park's colleague beside me. Then, in stages, his eyes dropped to Cora, sitting small and straight in her school clothes with her stuffed moose. Looking back at him with an expression I don't have the right word for, not anger, not grief, not a child's fear. Something much older. Absolute steadiness. His girlfriend put her hand on his arm and said something fast and low. He didn't appear to hear her. "What is she doing here?" The words came out before he could shape them into anything composed. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder. "I'm here with my niece," I said, "and her legal representative." His lawyer stepped forward with the practiced calm of someone whose job requires it. "My client's sister has no standing in this proceeding." "Actually," Ms. Park's colleague said, and her voice was extremely pleasant, the tone of a person who has done this many times and finds it goes better with pleasantness. "We have an emergency injunction application, a sworn affidavit from my client, the original trust agreement from the estate of the late trustee, and documentary evidence of a fraudulent court authorization on the listing agreement your client filed." She set a thick folder on the applicant's table. "We have quite a lot of standing." The judge reviewed our materials for a long time without speaking. Long enough that I stopped being able to track individual seconds. I was aware of Cora's arm against mine. I was aware of Buddy the Moose's left ear, which had been slightly flattened for as long as I could remember, and which Cora periodically tried to reshape. I was aware of my own breathing, which was slower than it had any right to be. When the judge finally looked up, he did not look at Ms. Park's colleague. He did not look at me. He looked at my brother's lawyer with the measured expression of someone who has seen a great number of things in a great number of courtrooms and who has learned to be precise because precision matters here in a way it doesn't elsewhere. He said that the fabrication of a court seal constituted a serious criminal matter and that he would be referring the documentation to the appropriate authorities. He said that the trust terms were unambiguous and that no legitimate court authorization for the sale existed in any record his clerk could locate. He granted the emergency injunction, freezing the property transfer effective immediately, voiding the listing agreement, and ordering a full judicial review of the trustee's conduct. My brother sat down very hard in his chair. His girlfriend did not sit down. She turned to his lawyer. The lawyer she had, as it later emerged, helped to retain, and she said, clearly, without lowering her voice at all, "I told him not to forge the document. That was entirely his decision. I need it on the record that I told him this was going too far." My brother looked at her. She did not look back at him. It was that moment, not the injunction, not the judge's ruling, not any of the legal machinery grinding into motion, that I think finished something in him permanently. The person he'd risked everything for was already mid-pivot, already calculating her own distance from the wreckage, before he'd even had time to understand the full shape of what had just collapsed. The gavel came down. The session closed. In the gallery, someone behind me exhaled very slowly, the sound of a breath that has been held too long. Cora reached over and took my hand. She didn't squeeze it dramatically. She just held it, the way you hold something you intend to keep. The months after that morning were quiet in the way that things are quiet after a storm has moved through. Not peaceful exactly, but stilled. An absence of noise where noise had been. The Ontario Real Estate Association launched its own disciplinary review. Separate from the criminal proceedings the Crown pursued for breach of trust and fraud under the Criminal Code. My brother's real estate license was suspended pending the outcome, which effectively ended his ability to practice. The sale he'd arranged fell apart when the buyer was notified of the injunction. The listing agencies severed their relationship with him once the details of the forged authorization became public. He'd spent 15 years building a career, and he did it chasing money that had never belonged to him, from a child who had already lost nearly everyone who loved her. The court appointed the public guardian and trustee of Ontario to manage the Muskoka property until Cora reaches the age of majority, a neutral body, no stake in the outcome beyond protecting the asset. The original trust terms, the value her great-uncle had worked his whole life to preserve for her, all of it remains intact. The cottage is still there, on the lake, in the same condition it was in the summers before he died, waiting for her. We went up in September, just the two of us. The drive took about 2 hours, and Cora was quiet for most of it. Not unhappy, just inward, the way she gets when she's thinking through something she's not ready to say yet. The key was still where it always was, hung on a small hook inside the firewood box on the porch. She walked through the whole place slowly, touching things. The kitchen tiles, the windowsills, the old wool quilt folded over the reading chair that had been in the same position for as long as anyone could remember. She stood for a long time in the back bedroom, looking out at the dock and the water. Eventually she came and stood beside me on the dock. The lake was doing that thing it does in September. Going glassy in the late afternoon. The tree line, perfectly doubled in the reflection. The loon somewhere off to the left in the reeds. "He left this for me," she said. "He did. Because he knew I'd take care of it." I looked out at the water. As for what came after, the custody process took time, the way these things do in Ontario. home studies, assessments, reports from the Office of the Children's Lawyer, paperwork that could fill several binders. My brother was in no position to provide stable care, while facing a criminal proceeding and the collapse of his professional life. The Children's Aid Society was involved briefly, and briefly was enough. At the end of it all, I was granted temporary legal guardianship of Cora, with a clear pathway toward permanency, if that was what we both decided we wanted. Her backpack is not packed anymore. Her winter coat is on the hook by my front door, between mine and the spare I keep for guests. Her drawings are on my refrigerator. She makes one almost every week now, and I've run out of surface area, so some of them are on the cabinet doors. She started the school year at a new school closer to my apartment, and within 2 months, she'd made a best friend and gotten herself onto the intramural hockey team, which she announced one Tuesday morning over toast and peanut butter with the deliberate casualness of someone who is very excited, but is attempting to play it cool, and then grinned so wide. I had to pretend to look for something in the fridge so she wouldn't see me tear up. I didn't understand on that Wednesday evening, when she came through my door with a stuffed moose and a folded piece of paper she'd found in a briefcase, that I was about to become someone's family in the only sense that has ever actually mattered. I thought I was doing a favor for a few days. I thought I was watching a child. But she had already decided to trust me before I had decided anything at all. She had already worked out, with the particular logic of a child who has had to think carefully about who is actually reliable, that I was someone she could hand a piece of evidence to at 11 o'clock at night and say, "Please don't call him yet." She had already figured out that I would show up. All I had to do was prove her right. I used to think bravery was something you felt before you acted, a readiness that arrived like weather, something you waited for. It turns out it's mostly something you feel afterward. You look back at the moment you picked up the phone at 11 at night or walked through a courtroom door you weren't sure you had the right to walk through. And you think, I didn't know I could do that. I just did it because there was no one else, and because she was counting on me, and because a man who had been dead for 2 years had loved a little girl enough to make sure she'd be taken care of. And I wasn't about to let that be undone. Family isn't always the people you started with. Sometimes it's the 8-year-old who hands you a piece of paper and says, "Promise you won't call him yet," and trusts you with everything she has left. If you found out someone in your own family was secretly taking something that didn't belong to them, from a child, from someone who couldn't fight back alone, what would you do? Would you step in, or would you tell yourself it wasn't your place? I'm genuinely asking. I think about that question more than I ever used to.